Good afternoon, everyone. Pete Pardo here from Sea of Tranquility. Welcome to another edition of our show. We've got a really special one here today, one that we've been talking about for weeks and weeks and weeks. We're sitting here in the brewery at Orange County Hops in Walden, New York. Look who's back. Owner and proprietor, Mike Antonelli. It's all about Miles Davis today.
Hi, everybody.
Nice shades.
I had to do my best Miles impersonation.
There you go.
So,
there you go.
They won't last long because as soon as I have to look at my notes, they come off because I got to put on my regular glasses. Otherwise, I can't see what I'm looking at.
There you go. Well, I got my glasses here, too. So today, like I said, we've been talking about this one for a while. This one's going to be all about Miles Davis, exploring Miles Davis through the decades. So basically, the idea behind this show, we were originally going to do like a top 10 Miles Davis albums or, trying to do songs is next to impossible because he's got such a ridiculously large discography and wealth of material. So Mike said, well, why don't we kind of break it down by decade and we give kind of what we consider the best Miles Davis albums to look for and to explore in each of the decades that he recorded music in. So that's kind of where we're going to start here. And obviously we're going to go way back. Way back. So Mike is actually going to kick it off. Most of Miles' recorded history as a solo artist or as a band leader started in the 50s, but he was actually pretty active throughout the latter half of the 40s, working with various other very notable jazz musicians, which Mike is going to kind of lead us in here and talk about a lot of that really, really early period before all of those, popular and not so popular Miles Davis releases that, the jazz purists might know. But some of those who are maybe a little bit new to Miles or jazz might not be familiar with. So, Mike, kick it off for us.
Well, thank you, Pete. I just want to say once again, it's a pleasure to collaborate with you and to be on your show once again. That's something I look forward to. Every time you ask me, it's a brand new assignment, and I feel very humbled by some of the assignments you give me because it makes me dig in very deeply and try to make sense out of some very difficult topics.
Well, I enjoy having you on, and hopefully none of these have been too difficult. Yeah, in the end, it's all a lot of fun for us.
It's even
though there is a lot of research that goes into doing shows like this, but I think for Mike and I both agree that this kind of research is actually a lot of fun because you're actually going back and you're rediscovering and re-looking at discographies and bodies of musical works by a lot of our heroes, and I mean, nothing to complain about that, right?
Right,
right.
Yeah. And I want to just say that I didn't pick necessarily the best Miles. I picked kind of my favorite Miles for different reasons, and paired certain recordings with certain monumental events or changes in his life and his recording. And Miles was one of these guys who was always surrounded by the best musicians, and he had several different periods where his music changed, and because his music changed so dramatically, he had to get new players involved, and he got the best players that were representative of whatever direction he was going in at the time. And so his bands, there's specific bands that he played with, and I mean big names. So we'll start right off, like you said, with Miles' collaboration with Charlie Parker. Mm-hmm. So Miles came to New York in the late 40s, and he did some recordings in New York City with Charlie Parker and various bebop musicians who were on the scene at the time. So I picked two from the 40s here, and I'm going to lose the shades already.
The mask is gone.
Yeah. All right. So, November 26, 1945, WR Studios in Broadway, New York City. He made a recording with Charlie Parker on alto sax, Max Roach on drums, Curly Russell bass, and two pianists. One named Sadiq Hakim, I think he pronounced his name. And the other one was Dizzy Gillespie, who happened to be Charlie Parker's trumpet player at the time. So here comes this young cat to town, Miles, and he didn't, force Dizzy out of the band, but Dizzy took a back seat on his main instrument for this recording and let Miles play. So that's why I picked that. One of his earlier recordings, and it was called The Charlie Parker Story. That's the name of the record. the Charlie Parker story, and recorded again in 1945 in New York City. So, it was just after the war. Great bebop songs. Some of them that Miles penned. And then I picked another one from 1947 in New York City called The Immortal Charlie Parker. And on that one, Miles has actually two of his own compositions. The very first appearance of Milestones was on that recording with Charlie Parker, and also a tune that Charlie Parker was credited with at the time as being the composer, but we found out later on through some diligent research that Miles actually penned a composition, a tune called Donnelly, based on the old standard Back Home Again in Indiana. Also on there, Chasing the Bird, some other notable bebop compositions from Charlie Parker. Anyway, again, with Max Roach, Curly Russell. This time, Hank Jones was the pianist. One of the famous Jones brothers. Kai Winding on the trombone. Coleman Hawkins guest appeared on tenor sax. And also somebody who I'd never heard of before named Howard Johnson appeared on alto on that record. So again, that's called The Immortal Charlie Parker, and that's from 1947.
And again, you're going to hear a lot of these names throughout this show, because a lot of these guys played with each other on and off throughout the decades, and a lot of them went on to become leaders in their own right, in their own ensembles. So it's really kind of, when you look at it, the caliber of the musicians that came out of Parker's bands, Miles Davis's bands, Dizzy Gillespie's bands. I mean, all these kind of like well-known kind of band leaders spawned all of these great musicians who then went on to become band leaders in their own right, and very, very popular artists and musicians. Cool. So that's the 40s. So the 50s, different story.
50s when Miles really came into his own, and especially as a leader. So I don't know if you wanted to go first or.
All right, that's fine. So, I really labored with trying to pick the 50s era stuff, and Mike and I kind of talked about this on and off over the last couple of weeks as we were getting ready to do this. And there's so many great ones that you could pick from this decade. This is, probably, I think, what most jazz historians would consider Miles's true classic bebop era, right? Because he would go
hard bop.
Oh, yeah, exactly. So I included 4. I know we're going to try and do 2 each. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick 2 here from this decade, and then after Mike picks his, I'll give out a couple of honorable mentions here. But I'm going to go with right around at the start of the decade, and this was actually recorded in 1949. But released in later on in the decade. 49 and 50 is when these sessions kind of happen. Birth of the Cool has got to be mentioned here. It's probably one of the most famous Miles Davis recordings, and I think most people who are maybe casual jazz fans and know a little bit about Miles Davis have probably heard those. If you haven't, 3 sessions from those 2 years, released in 1957 on Capitol Records. And again, some of the classic stuff, got Moon Dreams, all right, Venus de Milo, Jeru, Move. You got Miles Davis on trumpet. You got Cal Winding on trombone, Junior Collins on French horn, Bill Barber on tuba, Lee Konitz on alto sax, Jerry Mulligan on baritone sax, Al Haig on piano, Joe Shulman on bass, Max Roach, again, going to hear these names over and over, on drums, as well as many others, but those were the bulk of the musicians on these sessions. So Birth of the Cool, definitely something to hear if you haven't. There's a couple others I could choose here. I'm going to go with the obvious 2 choices, because Mike might pick one of the others. Kinda Blue from 1959. Again,
classic Miles.
Classic. Again on Columbia. So What? Freddie Freeloader. I mean, these are jazz staples here. All blues, flamenco, sketches with Bill Evans, right? So here you got Miles, you got Julian Cannonball Adderley, okay, on alto sax. All right, you got John Coltrane on tenor sax. These are heavyweights heavyweights of jazz. Bill Evans, who we just mentioned, Wynton Kelly, Paul Chambers on double bass, Wynton Kelly on piano, and Jimmy Cobb on drums. So those are the two that I'm going to go with that probably are obvious choices, but I think if you are new to Miles, that's a great place to start. All right, I've got two others that I'll mention after Mike, if Mike doesn't already talk about them, and I'll mention two others as like next places to go after those two.
So since I knew you were going to pick the couple of popular ones, you know, and I would pick them too. They're also some of my favorites. You know, they say,
as I always say, they're classic for a reason, right?
Yeah. Well, the Kind of Blue album is considered to be, by some statisticians, to be the number 1 selling jazz record of all time.
Yeah.
Like, it's got the fifth dimension platinum status. So you know, those are obvious. I'm going to go with something a little bit more obscure, and I'll give you a little historical note on it. I'm going to go with 1954. First of all, the original Rudy Van Gelder Studios in Hackensack, New Jersey. This was recorded there, and it's called Bag's Groove, featuring Milt Jackson from the Modern Jazz Quartet. Also, he had notable musicians there on this that included Thelonious Monk, who was on the title track, who there are stories that I've heard that Miles and Monk they clashed. They didn't get along very well together. But regardless, they recorded together. And also Sonny Rollins was on this track with Miles. You don't hear a lot of Miles and Sonny, but this happened to be featuring 3 Sonny Rollins tunes on this album. This again from 1954. Origin, Sonny Rollins classic, Doxy, and also Oleo. And the significance of Oleo is that is the first recording that Miles used the mute in his horn in the studio.
Wow.
And that became his traditional sound, and his classic Miles sound became that sound with Miles using a muted trumpet. The first time he used it in a recording was 1954 on this record, Bag's Groove, Miles Davis.
Yeah, I was going to say, why don't we show
Prestige.
that? That's an actual shot of the...
That's the album cover. I didn't have that album cover.
That's it right there. Very cool.
Yeah. So, you know, a little history to throw in there with that. And then I'm going to go with, so that's one of the Miles Davis innovations, let's say, is that classic sound that he had with the mute, and, you know, there were some other things that we'll come across later. The second one was his collaboration with the great composer orchestrator Gil Evans, and that began with this album in 1957 called Miles Ahead.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Miles Ahead, with a 19-piece jazz orchestra arranged by Gil Evans. There was one of the most prolific pairing of a composer and arranger, and both of those guys stayed together for quite a few albums. You know, Sketches of Spain and
Sketches of Spain is terrific.
Yeah,
very different.
Yeah,
but beautiful album.
Yeah, and where they mixed some classical, actually, what would you call it, contemporary compositional music with jazz and with orchestrations. So those are my two from the 50s. I have honorable mentions, of course, like you do as well, but I'll save them for later when I get into some of the other things we're going to talk about, because we have 2 other decades to go through. So
we do. All right, so I'll save mine as well.
All right.
So we're going to go to the 60s. For me, as much as I love the stuff from the 50s, I'm a huge fan of the stuff in the 60s. He had some amazing bands throughout that decade, specifically the classic band with Wayne Shorter on saxophone, Herbie Hancock on piano, Ron Carter on double bass, and Tony Williams on drums. I mean, that, for me, arguably could be the greatest Miles Davis band ever.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And I think for me, the Miles Smiles band, I mean the Miles Smiles album from 1966 on Columbia Records is just absolutely incredible. I mean, it's got Footprints, a legendary song by Wayne Shorter. It's got The Circle. It's got Dolores, another Wayne Shorter. I mean, I think also that's worth mentioning what a great songwriter Wayne Shorter was and how important to that lineup.
Absolutely.
So there's a couple tracks there, right? Definitely a great album. And and Mike is going to talk about others as well from that era, from the mid-'60s lineup. But as we get later into the decade, all of a sudden Miles starts to explore this thing which would, and arguably he was the creator of something that we now know as jazz fusion, which was a fusion of jazz and rock. Because as the 60s was winding down, you had flower power, psychedelia, and all that kind of stuff going on in the rock world. And Miles is like, hey, I want to play to bigger audiences too. I want to sell more records and all that kind of stuff. And he started paying attention to a lot of these bands and paying attention to guys like Jimi Hendrix and saying, you know what, I want to start doing some of that stuff. And all of a sudden he started bringing in a different cast of characters, guys like Chick Corea on electric piano, all right? Guys like John McLaughlin on electric guitar, all right? Guys like Joe Zawinul, later of Weather Report, on electric piano and organ. Dave Holland on bass. Tony Williams still around on drums. Other guys kind of floated in and out of the band throughout those couple of years. And in 1969 on Columbia Records released what, again, arguably could be one of the first jazz fusion albums ever in a silent way. Tunes like the title track, It's About That Time, Shh, and Peaceful. I mean, these are all, extended pieces that mix like that classic jazz sound with electronic instruments that, really was something new. And again, for the jazz purists, they're like, what is this noisy music that Miles is doing now, right? Because that didn't go well with a lot of the jazz critics and fans of classic jazz at the time, but yet all of a sudden, younger listeners are all of a sudden starting to listen to this new music that Miles is making and thinking, hey, this is pretty cool.
And he surrounded himself with the youngest up-and-coming musicians on the scene.
That could do it,
which is something that he did throughout his tenure. He always picked, the bright rising talent. As we go from the first generation of Miles' first classic quintet with Coltrane and Cannonball and Wynton Kelly and Jimmy Cobb and Paul Chambers. And that group was the staple of Miles throughout the 50s. Then when he got with Wayne Shorter and Tony Williams, and that was the Miles of the 60s, and Herbie Hancock was a very young and up-and-coming 19-year-old pianist when he started playing with Miles. So I would say that those two different groups, and it's interesting what the record industry, how they reacted to the different changes and how they revisited those different time periods by using archival material and re-releasing it at the same time Miles was putting out some jazz fusion stuff. Some of the older recordings, a couple live recordings and some collaborations that he did, were released in the 70s featuring those musicians now who were mostly gone.
Yeah.
And I'll get to that in a second. I thought that was kind of cool. So,
it's a good lead-in, right?
Yeah.
I think I know where you're going here.
Yeah.
So okay.
So I'm gonna go here with that next generation, young generation Miles here. This is Miles Davis on trumpet, Wayne Shorter on tenor sax, Tony Williams, Ron Carter on the bass, and Herbie Hancock. This is called ESP, and it was released in 1965.
Great album.
Yeah. Ralph Gleason did a beautiful poem on the back of this, on this record here, that is a compilation of all Miles's titles to all his songs that were done in a poem form, and you're supposed to read this while you're listening to the music. So he made this abstract poem, and stuff like that is what I really miss about the age of the LP. When you open up the record and there's a jacket and there's liner notes galore and whatever, and you can really have an experience. Back in our day, it was a real experience opening up and spending time. It's like having a book in your hand, as opposed to reading it off one of those, what do you call it, a cell phone.
Oh yeah, or a CD. I mean, the CDs
CD.
the CDs are mini replicas of these, but
Yeah.
I need my glasses to read anything on a CD.
I need my glasses to see Sam over there across the room. Hey, Sam, buddy.
And also on the album cover here, of course, that's Miles's lady. That's Cicely Tyson, if I remember correctly, right?
Yeah.
So
Beautiful Cicely.
and a lot of really great. I mean, there's a handful of fantastic albums, and they were doing what, 2 a year. I mean,
Yeah.
because that lineup was together for not a long time, right? It's only about 3-4 years, right?
I'm going to say 6 or 7 years.
Was it that long?
I
Yeah.
think.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. But anyway, and it gives you realize how closely critics and writers and review like I said, critics, how closely knit they were and part of this community when the musicians would go to the writer and say, "Hey, write something for my liner notes." I think it's something that's
It's lost.
kind of lost today.
No, it's not kind of. It is. Yeah.
Especially when everything went digital. So
That's why I was actually absolutely honored when Mike came to me about a year ago and said, "Hey, I'm releasing a new live CD. I would love for you to write the liner notes to that." And I was absolutely honored because that's not something that happens every day,
Yeah.
right? And it adds like
Yeah.
a nice little personal touch.
Yeah.
And I absolutely agree with you.
something you can revisit from time and time again.
Yep. Nefertiti also is another very, very good album from
very awesome.
that period there
So
too.
I'm going to go with something here. I know you don't usually include live albums, but
That's okay. We can do it here.
so here's another one. Recorded at Avery Fisher Hall in New York City. Miles Davis, 4 and More. Recorded live in concert. Great tunes from the early bands that was with Coltrane and Cannonball and then that lineup. So What, Walkin', Joshua, 4, 7 Steps to Heaven, and then the standard, There Is No Greater Love. The great Billy Taylor, composer and author and pianist, wrote the liner notes for this. But the difference was that this band was the band that he was currently working with, which was Herbie Hancock, George Coleman replaced Wayne Shorter on this live recording, Ron Carter, and Tony Williams. What's cool about this, and why I picked this particular one from the 60s, 2 reasons. Number one, I said, because they were playing with his new lineup, he's playing some of the old music that was classic jazz. And these guys took it to another level. They played all those old songs with breakneck speed and great fast tempos. So it was a new concept. It was an old concept with new players, except for Miles. Sorry about that.
That's okay. See, guys, it happens in my
Live.
studio at home too. I mean, it's
We're closed.
and that's also on Columbia, correct? They
Yes,
released on Columbia
this is
Records?
his Columbia. He was with Columbia for like 10 years, I
Yeah.
guess, in the 60s and whatever. So that would give me 2 in the 60s, right? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Cool. I need to hear that. I've never heard that album.
Oh, really?
You'll have to blast that after we're
I'll
done. Right?
put it on for you. See, I got old school. See, I could do this. See, I have over here this old. This is for those of your listeners who don't recognize what this is. This is an LP, folks. Long playing record, 33 and RPM.
12-inch disc.
We actually have a lot of listeners who love vinyl, so
Okay.
they get on my case a lot for just
Good.
always showing CDs and no vinyl. But sorry, guys.
So, this is like Ron Carter playing Paul Chambers' bass line and changes it up a little bit. But I'm going to put this up here so you can see it while it's playing. You're not going to hear it because the YouTube police won't allow it.
No, they won't.
But we can hear it. You can.
So I think it's safe to say that the 60s was a pretty productive decade for Miles and company. And once again, like we spoke about in the 50s, the 60s spawned a lot of superstars from the various Miles Davis lineups throughout that time period, who would go on to play in bands like Weather Report and Mahavishnu Orchestra and Return to Forever and Herbie Hancock's Headhunters, so on and so forth. So, pretty notable players. So that brings us to the 70s.
Already.
Yeah. I mean, I'm a big fan of Miles's stuff from the 70s as well. And I'm already looking at what Mike's got over there, and I'll get to that one in a second. Or maybe I won't steal your thunder and I'll just let you talk about it. But, first of all, 1970 saw the release of a groundbreaking album in the then not known as, but what we now know as jazz fusion. So he got together with a bunch of guys between August 19th and 21st, 1969 in New York City to record what later became the Bitches Brew album, released in early 1970. So again, this is Miles on trumpet with guys like Wayne Shorter on sax, Bernie Maupin on bass, clarinet, Joe Zawinul, Chick Corea, Larry Young on electric piano, John McLaughlin on electric guitar, Dave Holland on double bass, Harvey Brooks on bass guitar, Lenny White on drums. Lenny White, of course, also from later on to be in Return to Forever. Don Elias, Jack DeJohnette on drums, powerhouse drummer. All right. Juma Santos on percussion, Billy Cobham on drums, also soon to be going into Mahavishnu Orchestra with Miles Davis. Ayrton Moreira on percussion. Okay, he also played in a lot of bands afterwards. And this album, a double album, again, kind of ballsy back in the day, right? A double jazz album, right? Pharaoh's Dance, Bitches Brew, Miles Runs the Voodoo Down, Sanctuary, Spanish Key, all standout tracks from that Bitches Brew album that would then be played live for years and years to come. And as someone who's been listening to that album for a long time, it's really different. It's even, really different from those couple albums that came out before it. It just had this kind of like tribal African groove and atmosphere to it, and there were moments of, just dissonance and chaos and savage like rock passages that kind of mixed with, Miles's bleeding horn, okay, kind of far away in the distance with the rumbling bass and the drums in the background, just like unlike anything you'd ever heard before at the time. And he did really well with that album. I mean, that, again, if the album before it didn't appeal to a more younger, more rock-based audience, this one certainly did. And I think, we talked about, one of his greatest selling albums of all time. I think this was his best-selling album for the new decade, the 70s. So I was going to talk about the one you got sitting up right there, but I'll let you go ahead and do that, because I think we can both add some commentary on that. That actually, what Mike is going to show right now is my favorite Miles Davis album of all time. Jack Johnson, people.
So this album was the follow-up album to Bitches Brew. So on the heels of Bitches Brew, Miles didn't have to be worried so much about being a commercial success with its follow-up. So I think he picked this because it spoke to him, spoke to his heart in a way that it was commentary on his beliefs and his struggles as an African American at the time. And so he highlighted the career of someone he really respected, who kind of thumbed their nose at society at the time under a lot of pressure with this boxer named Jack Johnson, who basically
heavyweight champion of the world.
Heavyweight champion, and never lost a fight, and was told that if he didn't throw a fight, that he was going to end up, swinging or something from the trees. A very horrible thing that was said about him from the Ku Klux Klan. And no, he never backed down. And in fact, he was so successful, not only with his boxing career, but also with the ladies. And as it says here, men, most of them who were white, and drove very rich and fast cars, and he lived a fast life. And he died same way he lived, in a fast car.
Yeah.
So anyway, this is Miles' tribute to Jack Johnson, and I think it was as political a statement for him to make at the time than any other thing that he's done. And the music is just phenomenal. John
Basically
McLaughlin on guitar.
2 long tracks.
Yeah, and Steve Grossman,
Yeah.
who is a tenor player that found a lot of success in Europe. I think he still lives in Europe. We don't hear much about him over here today these days. At least I don't. And I wish I did, because he's a phenomenal, phenomenal saxophonist. I actually took lessons. His brother Hal Grossman is he might be retired by now, but he was an ear training teacher at Berkeley when I was there, and I had classes with Hal Grossman, and that's how I was introduced to his brother's music. And at that time in the 80s, this cat was just on fire, Steve Grossman. And so for him to be on this album, I think is a great tribute. Billy Cobham on drums, and Herbie Hancock, of course, Miles' longtime collaborator in the 60s and in the 70s. So from 71, Jack Johnson, you want to say any more about that?
One thing I do want to mention about this album and also about Bitches Brew is that, you know, they went into these sessions without, like, written compositions. I mean, basically, these 2 albums were came out of just jamming. I mean, you can get them now. They didn't release them back in the day, but there are, like, the complete collections of all the rehearsals and all the recordings from these sessions. And, I mean, these guys just go into the studio and just play for hours. And what they did was the producer went in and kind of like spliced sections and kind of pieced them together. So these were just, these albums just kind of came about from these monumental jam sessions with these true heavyweights of the genre.
Ted Macero is the producer on this that you're talking about, arranger and composer in his own right.
Yep. And just some real, I think, you know, if you're interested in the career of John McLaughlin, guitar player, I think he's got some savage stuff on this album that I think just basically set him on the path that he would then follow shortly thereafter in the Mahavishnu Orchestra, taking, of course, Billy Cobham along with him, right? But yeah, a lot of great players on this album. Mike mentioned a good chunk of them. You know, Chick Corea is on here as well. Dave Holland, Jack DeJohnette, you know, a great cast of characters, you know, playing little bits here and there. So again, they had numerous sessions over the span of those couple of days in 1971, and a landmark album. You got another one? I see you do.
I do. So here's another of those kind of obscure Miles albums. I still have the price tag on this. See? $2.99. I don't know if you could see that.
What a bargain!
Water Babies.
Can't beat
and it
that.
says demonstration, not for sale.
Aha.
So this little tag is on the bottom here. So,
Radio station copy, it sounds like?
Maybe. I don't know. I found it in a record bin somewhere. The classic Miles quintet there with from the 60s with Tony Williams, Herbie Hancock, Wayne Shorter, Chick Corea's on here a little bit, Dave Holland, Ron Carter, and of course Tony Williams. And again, this sounds to me like they just got in the studio and what we call today, free jazz, where somebody just starts a little theme and everybody follows suit. You know, there's quite a few great bands around. I play with one called In or Out, led by Rick Savage, a local guy from Warwick, and Joe Vicent Tranquina, Michael D'Agostino on the drums. They play here every once in a while, and it's a pleasure to just go up there and you just start playing and you don't know where it's going to go or what's going to happen. And when you get 5 premier jazz recording artists together and do that, here's what you get. You know, the results are tremendous. And
let the music do the walking, right?
yeah, absolutely. Let the music do the talking. Anyway, Water Babies. That's my pick. 2 picks for the 70s.
The 70s. All right, so as the 70s started to get towards the middle of the decade, Miles starts enjoying a certain drug called cocaine a little bit too much, and basically goes into hiding in his apartment in New York City and basically said goodbye to the rest of the 70s. right? He went into kind of in hiatus. His stopped releasing albums, stopped playing with people, stopped playing live, that sort of thing. And it wasn't until the very start of the 80s that he came out of his self-imposed exile, got himself cleaned up, and decided to get back to business once again.
Aha. But the 70s is not over, my friend, because the record executives, savvy as they were, did not want to let Miles go peacefully into the night.
Of course not.
No, because there was too much at stake, and they had too many recordings that they were sitting on from the old days. So here, I'm going to give you a little Miles without Miles releases. So this is pre-recorded stuff from different eras, and this is what I alluded to back earlier in the show when you said, when he was with the second classic group with Ron Carter and Tony Williams. Well, the first group with Paul Chambers and Philly Joe Jones and Jimmy Cobb. This one happened to be with Philly Joe Jones and Coltrane, Bill Evans on piano, and Cannibal Adderley. This is called Jazz at the Plaza. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with the Plaza Hotel in New York City, it was a beautiful, super high-end hotel in the city in the 40s, 50s, and the 60s. I had the opportunity to play at the Plaza one time before they turned it into condominiums with a 17-piece big band. And for us, it was like, wow, we get to play at the Plaza. Duke Ellington played there. Miles played there. They recorded a whole bunch of concerts. And for, in those days, when the music scene was still segregated in the early 50s, it was a big deal for these musicians to go play at the highfalutin Plaza Hotel, where the rooms at that time were the most expensive in the city.
Yeah, I can imagine.
So it was a totally different audience that these musicians were being exposed to playing at the Plaza, and they killed it. This is released in 1973 when Miles was on hiatus, but it consists of material that was played in 1958. So this is his group with, like I said, Philly Joe Jones, John Coltrane, Bill Evans from the late 50s, Paul Chambers, and this is a great collection of Miles tunes and others. Jazz at the Plaza is side one. My Funny Valentine. Side two is If I Were a Bell and Oleo. So it's a live recording with that group, and it is fantastic. One of my favorite Miles of all time.
That's another one I'm going to have to hear. It's a real shame when they kind of turn these old, great historic venues into, parking garages and condominiums and all that history gone, right?
Also released in 1973, totally different kind of Miles record. And this one features the collaboration songs with Gil Evans. And if we didn't say it enough, I want to just reiterate that Miles, the period that Miles was with Gil Evans, their styles matched so perfectly with that birth of the cool and the cool jazz style. That's one of Miles' innovations. Also, Miles started playing the flugelhorn. Before anybody else in jazz was carrying that horn, Miles was the guy who pioneered the use of the flugelhorn. So you got the cool school, the flugelhorn, the muted trumpet, and this is a collection of previously recorded songs from 1955 to 1962. So there are a ton of players. Fran Dance, Devil May Care, Little Melanie, Stella by Starlight, Budo, and really a great introduction to Miles. If you've never heard Miles before, try to find this basic Miles, try to find Miles Ahead, and try to find Kind of Blue, and I think you're going to have a real good start with the early Miles. Then if you go into the 60s, find the Bitches Brew and the albums with Herbie Hancock and Tony Williams, and then you got a nice cross-section of the great Miles Davis.
Yep. So the 80s. Miles is back. My first pick for the 80s is his actual return, which I've always dug quite a bit. Some people's opinions are mixed on it. But Columbia Records 1981, The Man with the Horn. It's actually a really strong record, I think. And he's got a red-hot band once again. He's got Gil Evans on sax. Mm-hmm. Okay. He's got Barry Finnerty on guitar. He's got Mike Stern on guitar. Mm-hmm. All right. Marcus Miller, the great Marcus Miller on
all
bass.
the new cats who were coming up in the 80s and then became household jazz icons, household names, and as we know them now, that they're in their 40s and 50s, these guys. But they were in their early 20s when they started playing with Miles.
Yeah. Al Foster.
Yeah, Al Foster, the great Al Foster. He's local here. He lives not far, I think, by Woodstock somewhere in the area.
Robert Irving, Randy Hall, Felton Cruz, Vincent Wilburn. Again, a lot of the, maybe not well known at the time, but we certainly know who all these guys are now. And I think for me, just kind of like, again, very different from his 70s stuff. I think that the Man with the Horn, he's starting to bring in some 80s style kind of funk and just more pop-based material, because he would go throughout the 80s, he would turn to more, pop-based song structures. But some great arrangements on here. I think Fat Time is a killer song. Aida, Ursula, Black Seat Betty, and the title track, The Man with the Horn. And I will say, because I'm a big Mike Stern fan, he delivers an absolute killer solo on the title track on here. I'm sorry, on Fat Time, not the title track. And he would go on to play with Miles throughout the next couple of years, including on 1983's Star People, which, I had a hard time picking two from this decade because there's a couple that I like quite a bit. But for me, I think Star People might just be the best one, and that's got Mike Stern. It also has a guy named John Schofield on guitar. Mm-hmm. So you got two guitar heavyweights. Yep, there he is right there.
Still right there.
Yep. Who else? Bill Evans also on saxophone. Marcus Miller's back again. Tom Barney on bass as well. Al Foster, Mino Cinello on percussion, and Gil Evans helped out with some of the arrangements. Okay, uncredited. Come and Get It, Star People, the title track. It Gets Better. Star on Sicily, again a song that he dedicated to Cicely Tyson. A lot of really strong tracks on this album that I think perfectly situated in the era that it was. Miles trying to come back and bring jazz into the 80s, but again embracing all of the current kind of musical styles that were going on at the time. So those are my two picks for the 80s, The Man with the Horn and Star People.
So I'll give you my only 80s. I'm going to go with The Man with the Horn as well. And I have a little story about that.
I was waiting.
When I was a student up at Berkeley in the early 80s, Miles did a return, and he did a concert series where he played a couple nights in New York, and then he played 2 nights in Boston at a club called Kix, Kix. And it was with that band, Mike Stern and Bill Evans, sax player, Marcus Miller on the bass,
Al Foster.
and Al Foster. And I happened to be in attendance. That was the only time I saw Miles. And as a young student of the music, I was thoroughly disappointed in Miles, only for the fact that Miles, I was playing electric trumpet, and he had his head down and his back to the audience the whole night, and he played very sparsely, and he let the other cats play, and he let them do all the talking basically on stage.
That's what he did the whole decade, though. Yeah, that was his thing.
Yeah, and as a guy who was really studying the music in depth and right from the bebop lines that he used to write and stuff, of course, I want to hear, if I'm going to hear Miles only once in my life, I want to hear him perform the way that my ears were just bleeding to hear him play his horn, and play the way I know Miles can play. But he played very little. He said very little. And I was really disappointed in Miles. Now, the other cats in the band just blew my head apart, and that's fine. And I really enjoyed myself at the concert. My only critique was that I was hoping that I could hear more of Miles. So I let that go. And I'll tell you when we get to the final, my final selection, and I'll tell you why that whole story. I've kind of resolve that. And I'll tell you in when we get to the end. So that's it for my picks. But
Cool.
I have one more, but that I'm going to save till it's my last.
Last turn to talk? Okay.
Yeah.
All right, so I guess we're at the point in the show where I've got a couple honorable mentions I want to just mention, and then I've got a selection of live albums that I wanted to kind of throw out there, because I know a lot of people tend to gravitate towards live albums because you kind of hear these musicians in their element on the stage. So
I go back to being Miles now.
There you go.
Again.
He's back. Yeah,
back.
He's back. Got the voice going there.
That's right.
I want to mention a couple albums from the 50s that I think are also well worth your attention. One is Roundabout Midnight from 1957, Columbia Records. Another one of his kind of classics. It's got the title track, which is, of course, a Thelonious Monk song. You've got All of You by Cole Porter, Bye Bye Blackbird, and Alucha, right? Is that how they say that, from Charlie Parker? Again, this has got Miles and Coltrane, Red Garland on piano, Paul Chambers on double bass, and Philly Joe Jones on drums. Also a song that Mike mentioned earlier on, but it's also an album called Milestones from 1958. And that actually might be my favorite Miles album from that period, from the 50s. I'm a big fan of Milestones. And again, that's with Miles and Cannonball Adderley, John Coltrane, Red Garland, Paul Chambers, and Philly Joe Jones. Another one of his probably best lineups. All right. Top two, without a doubt, however you want to kind of place them. But I think that is just a fantastic album. That's got Straight No Chaser on it. Okay, another Monk tune. Miles, Sid's Ahead, and Dr. Jekyll, all great songs. The whole album is great. So I wanted to mention those. And then just a little kind of primer of live albums. And these are from throughout his career. There's the Live at the Fillmore album, Fillmore East from 1970. Kind of noisy and chaotic, but that's like the beauty of it. That's like avant-garde Miles at his very best. There's My Funny Valentine from 1965. Black Beauty, also live at the Fillmore West. That's from 1973. Also kind of dissonant, chaotic during his heavy kind of funk period. And then two real beauties from the mid-70s, Agartha and Pangea. Both recorded in Tokyo, Japan, and featuring the extended lineup that had two guitar players, Pete Cosi and Reggie Lucas. And I do want to mention this is kind of important. So right around this time, Miles is going through this kind of very heavy 70s funk period with a lot of like African rhythms and screaming bluesy like acid guitar, because Miles and the late Jimi Hendrix always wanted to do an album together, but it never happened. Jimmy died way too young, but Miles kept kind of percolating to himself. I still want to do the kind of stuff that I wanted to do with that cat Jimmy, right? So I think that lineup right there was him trying to envision what it would have sounded like to go out and play with Hendrix. So those albums got grooves that never end, lots of screaming like fuzz wah-wah guitar leads, okay, and screaming horns all over the place. Just for a lot of people, not easy listens, but I really like those albums a lot. Dark Magus, released in 1977, which includes a show from Carnegie Hall, 1974, also really, really good. There's the legendary Miles and Coltrane, which was recorded in the recordings came from 55 and 58 in New York City and the Newport Jazz Festival, but that was not released until 1988 on Columbia. But that's well worth hearing, a great live album. And then, of course, got to mention Cooking with Plug Nickel, right? Which was released in 1987. That includes performances from 1965. All right, and if you like the Cooking at the Plug Nickel, like one disc or one LP set they also released the complete Plug Nickel, which is like four albums worth of material from that whole run there at the Plug Nickel. So that's all I got for Miles. I know Mike's got something he wants to finish up with here.
Okay. So, the great Quincy Jones. Miles was one of his heroes and an icon in his eyes and in many people's eyes, of course. But the one time Quincy got to play with Miles was shortly before his death, and Quincy convinced Miles to come and play at the Montreux Jazz Festival, as Quincy was the musical director for the last 3 seasons prior to this. So this this Miles and Quincy live at Montreux. This was released in 1993. However, it was recorded in a concert in June of 1991. And if you know anything about Miles' death, he died in the hospital in California in September of that year. So this was recorded just a couple of months before Miles died. There's one other recording in his discography with a small ensemble that was made after this. But for all intents, this is Miles' goodbye album. So by hearing this and hearing Miles playing the songs that he played, this is all featuring Gil Evans' arrangements, and it has two big bands on stage at the same time with Miles playing, and all kinds of heavy-duty instrumentation with French horns and large ensembles and bass clarinet and all the different the timbres that were used by Gil Evans in his arrangements. It features the work of a great gifted composer, Gil Goldstein, who is a pianist, contemporary pianist, jazz arranger. He's also an acquaintance of mine, very good friends with Joe Lovano and Judy Silvano. Gil Goldstein, he was instrumental, no pun intended, in reviving Gil Evans' arrangements for this, conducted by the great Quincy Jones. And here is Miles playing the music that he said he didn't want to revisit, and he did. And this is Miles live playing his freaking butt off. Okay? This is the last Miles that you're going to hear, and I guess they said it, and here the liner notes was Quincy was amazed at how Miles was able to have enough strength to get through the whole concert.
Not well. Yeah,
he was not well, but the music kind of brought him to life, and he says collaborating with Gil Evans was probably one of the highlights of his career, and also the tune he penned with Gil Evans called Boplicity was one of Miles's self-proclaimed best recordings that he ever made. Wow. That's according to Miles. It's in the liner notes here. You can read all about it. Also, I want to shout out to a friend of mine who's on this album, and he's playing alto saxophone in one of the ensembles here that is backing Miles. Mr. Sal Giorgiani is in the credits here, and I didn't know that when I bought this, but way to go, Sal.
That's a show we all wish we were at.
Yeah, but this kind of vindicated Miles in my mind for the performance that he left in my mind in 1981.
Yeah.
After listening to this, and you could feel the energy in the crowd, and it's just a great way to sign off.
Yep. Go out on top, right?
Go out on top, Miles.
Awesome.
So there you go.
There you guys have it. Exploring Miles Davis throughout the decades. All right, we're taking you from the 40s all the way up to the 90s, and hopefully you guys have a good starting point on where to explore this late but great, legendary jazz musician, one of the greatest of all time. And if you already are well into Miles Davis, hey, feel free to put some commentary below on other recommendations you might have that maybe we didn't touch on, so maybe some obscure stuff or what have you. There's so much. I mean, the discography of Miles Davis is like enormous. So we've tried here to kind of pinpoint down to some, must-hears as well as some good kind of more rare stuff that you should seek out as well. So,
yeah, and I just also want to mention one other thing about this. Yes, there's a couple of young soloists on here that contribute a lot to this record here, and it is the young Kenny Garrett.
Oh yeah,
on alto saxophone.
Yeah, I forgot he played
and
that.
Miles' stand-in for all the rehearsals with these two bands was now a household name in his own right, Wallace Roney, great trumpeter.
So very cool.
Yeah.
So in closing, just wanted to thank everybody for watching today. And I know there's a lot going on in the world right now. A lot of it very pleasant. But I think that hopefully we've given you just under an hour's worth of some fun content about a legend to kind of take you away from everything that's going on out there right now. So if you guys are just getting the link to this right now, set aside an hour, stop worrying about where you're going to get your toilet paper from and all the other nonsense that's happening, and get off of CNN and Fox News for a little while and just kind of stop and reflect and let the music kind of take you over. Listen to what we have to say. Go out and listen to some of these albums, and I think it'll be a good break from reality to explore the music of the great Miles Davis, because he's got a lot of great music to explore. And this is just what we talked about today is the fraction of all of it. So, Mike, thanks again for having me at the...
Pete?
We're doing the safe thing, right?
We're doing safe... What?
Elbow bumps?
It's social distancing,
as
they call it. Social distancing, yes.
So
not making fun of that,
No, you got to do it well.
You got to do it right, especially for protection.
Yeah.
Protect the elderly and the unknown about this invisible germ that we're all fighting. We're all in this together, as they say. And so let's get through it.
And we will.
And keep the music going.
Yep. And if you guys live in the area, Mike is open a couple hours each day to fill up your growler. So if you want to come in and
as long as you have been practicing safe practices with this COVID-19 going around, and you don't have any symptoms or haven't come into contact with anybody who's tested positive, and you're thirsty, we'll be happy to fill up your growler and send you on your way. Stay safe, stay healthy.
Yep. Take care, everybody, and make sure to visit us on the web at www.citytranquility.org. We're on Facebook. We're on Twitter. Of course, we're on YouTube all the damn time. So look out for more stuff tomorrow. Hopefully, we're going to get to ranking the studio albums of the Beatles tomorrow, all right, as well as Santana. That's hopefully what you got looking up for tomorrow, as well as we got some new product reviews. We got a new release from Pat Metheny, The Outlaws, Black Swan, some new stuff. So a lot coming at you tomorrow. So stay tuned. And for Mike Antonelli, I'm Pete Pardo. And Sam, we'll see you real soon, guys. Take care. Bye-bye.